So following the book by Lawrence Stone, The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, we have talked about the earlier dominant models, so the open lineage family and the restricted patriarchal nuclear family. And according to Lawrence Stone, the Age of Enlightenment corresponds with another model, the closed domesticated nuclear family. He gives the dates 1640 to 1800, which is more or less from the very beginning of the Enlightenment, so the works of Isaac Newton and the beginning of the scientific method, even to the end of the chronological 18th century. So he covers a little bit of the later period, starting with the French Revolution. And what is really important for Stone, why is it called closed domesticated nuclear family? We had this concept of the nuclear family before. It means the immediate family, the family consisting of a couple and their children. And it is becoming closed and domesticated. So closed to the external influence of distant relatives, kin, local community. It's becoming kind of centered on itself, and it's further withdrawn from the community, centered on a home. The house and home become very important focus points for the 18th century, for the Georgians. Next week I will tell you quite a lot about that. It will be based on a documentary series, another BBC documentary series called At Home with the Georgians. So if you want to watch it ahead, you may try to find it, At Home with the Georgians. So the family life centered on the home and the importance of the home. So further walling off of the nuclear family, further withdrawal from the community. Of course, let me remind you, if you compare the dominant modes of social life, try to compare them with those that went before and not after. Those people had no idea what would happen a few generations after they died. They could know perhaps what happened before in one or two previous generations, or if they were interested in history further back, but they had no idea what would happen later. So if we see progress, if we see liberalization of private life, it is always relative to what went before and not what went later. So for our eyes, it is still quite restricted. It is still quite patriarchal. It is still probably unlivable for most people nowadays, but for the people actually living in the 18th century, and especially in the second half of the 18th century, this is modern, this is liberated, this is wonderful. So we have a development of much warmer relations between the husband and wife, and consequently, although not immediately, between parents and children. We have the increasing recognition of eroticism, of sensuality, inclusion of eroticism in marital relations, compared to earlier times, not to later times. The identification of children as special status group. So these are the things that will really be changing. And as Stone says, basically he says the same I told you. If you are true, if you are right about history, other sources that you consult will basically tell the same. So the most important thing is individualism. Individualism. You start seeing that in the 17th century with the beginning, for example, of realistic portraits and realistic depictions on family tombs. Earlier, you had just type depictions. There was a lady or a knight or a child without any individualized traits. In the 17th century, you start having realistic portraits. So it means that these people at least recognized the uniqueness of each person. We start having literature, novels, very often in the form of diaries or autobiographies, such as Clarissa or Robinson Crusoe or Tom Jones. These are fictional stories made up to resemble real life stories of possible people. So, of course, dramatic stories, stories of dramatic adventures like Robinson Crusoe being stranded on a desert island, or Tom Jones, relatively poor young man advancing in the world, or a servant trying to find her place in life and marry the master's son or something like that. So we have the kind of surface tale of adventure, but it's always individualized adventure. And in fact, this is really about humans, about psychology, about the way that people feel and think and behave. As Stone says, in 1725, we start having first libraries. The first circulating library, it means you pay the entrance fee and then you can borrow the books and change the books regularly, was established in a very fashionable Georgian city of Bath. This was the place known from the Roman or even pre-Roman times for its mineral springs, and in the 18th century it had a kind of renewed popularity because all the rich and influential people from the high society would go there to take the waters, so basically to have a kind of spa holidays. So a lot of wonderful new residences were built, and everybody who was anybody would go there, including for a short period Jane Austen herself. She was not rich or famous, but her family tried to make a living there. So one of the things, of course, were the mineral springs, but a part of that, there was a lot of socializing. There was a lot of kind of intellectual and social ferment in the assembly rooms, which were like a club for the people vacationing in Bath. So they would go there. There would be a tea room or a kind of coffee house there, so they could enjoy like a cafe scenery. They could participate in balls and dances organized in the assembly rooms, and they could also enjoy reading, which was a new, wonderful social attraction. You could read those fascinating novels, then discuss them with your friends, exchange them at the local library. So what we have among the rich is the reorientation of culture towards the pursuit of pleasure. Because if we acknowledge that your life is unique, it just happens once, you will not be born again. So more and more people try to build, even subconsciously, some sort of individual identity, and they believe that pursuit of happiness and pleasure is something worthwhile. You only live once, so when you die it's over. Of course, the previous generations put all the emphasis on salvation after death. In the Age of Enlightenment, People want to be happy before they die, not after they die. So we have a visible reorientation of culture towards the pursuit of pleasure in the leisure activities, such as vacations and baths, such as the grand tour. So if you could afford it, a wonderful cultural tour of Europe, of France and Italy, and sometimes even further afield to Greece and Egypt and Constantinople. So pleasure, but usually with some formative elements. So you would like to be entertained, but at the same time you would like to learn something, to experience something. Yeah, but generally this is one of the effects of the Enlightenment, and the secularization. The authority of the clergy is diminishing. Perhaps not to the extent of, let's say, the modern world, but definitely compared with the times of the Puritans, this is absolutely a dramatic change. So this secularization leads to the conclusion that humans, well, in the 18th century they mostly talk of men, but they mean humans, are no longer seen as part of the great chain of being. So the creatures made in the image of God and whose main function for existence is to develop spiritually. The body was always seen as sinful and dirty and really unimportant. This changes in the 18th century. So we have something I already mentioned, more recognition of sexual relations for pleasure in marriage, or if you were forced to marry, you were not attracted to, there is more tolerance towards extramarital liaisons. So yes, there is a whole culture of flirtation. If you think, for example, about the Dangerous Liaison, the French epistolary novel, so novel in the form of letters, it tells you about the whole culture of seduction, flirtation, mostly among married people. But if it was discreet, and of course considering that most marriages, especially in the first half of the 18th century, were still very strictly arranged, and the young people were forced to marry somebody who was not of their choosing, there is a growing awareness that perhaps people should be allowed to find some sexual fulfillment and emotional fulfillment outside of marriage. We start having first reactions, especially in the second half of the 18th century, towards those darker aspects of culture. So the first voices towards the abolition of slave trade, for example. Also against cruel sports, or the treatment of the mentally ill. So probably two more dark aspects of the 18th century. The cruel sports, I mean, are things like bullfighting. It was never only reduced to Spain. It was everywhere. So bullfighting, bear fighting, dog fighting, these were very popular pastimes, mostly because they were connected with gambling. And gambling was a very popular, I would say, social vice in the 18th century. So you might just gamble playing cards or dice, but you might gamble like which dog would win, or whether the bullfighter would kill the bull, or the bull would kill the bullfighter. This is increasingly seen as morally wrong. We will talk about it next week when we talk about William Hogarth and his ideas concerning cruelty to animals. But we have the first voices. Again, it will take a long time. It will be really codified in the 19th century, like the abolition of slave trade. But we have the first voices, very often rational voices, like that cruelty to animals is a kind of school of cruelty that would lead to cruelty and crime against people in the longer run. So the connection with mistreating animals to murder, you'll see that. Also, I mentioned the treatment of the mentally ill. This is also something which changes, and something that might perhaps shock us nowadays, but in the early 18th century, still some rich, fashionable people would visit a local insane asylum to laugh at the patients there. Because, you know, insane people are so funny. They behave in an irrational way. They have delusions, and they do kind of stupid things. So let's laugh at them. This happened in the 18th century, but it stops happening in the 18th century. You may see some evidence of that in Hogarth's work. One of the characters from his paintings and engravings, especially from the cycle called A Rake's Progress. A rake is a kind of spendthrift young man who squanders the money he inherited, and he ends up in an insane asylum. And you can see some visitors just coming to observe and laugh the misery of the insane. But with the king, George III, contracting a sort of mental illness, this becomes, I would say, less elegant to jeer and laugh at the insane people. So at least the practice, the fashion for visiting a local asylum just for laughs goes out of use. What else do we have? We have the growing need of privacy. So you will see, we'll probably talk about it next week because it's a longer subject, the changes in the domestic architecture and domestic design, private rooms, private spaces, private furniture. People want more personal and bodily privacy. So they want to have their own places to keep the, I don't know, secret correspondence. They want more segregation from the servants. Before, servants were kind of furniture that was alive. It was a common consensus. Servants are just living furniture. In the 18th century, they are still indispensable in larger households, so you have to put up with them. And they usually live on the premises as well. But they start using like separate doors and separate corridors, not to be constantly in the way of the masters. We have the popularization of some new inventions. Some earlier inventions from the 16th century, but by the beginning of the 18th century, they are everywhere. Things like the night dress, so the nightgown, rather than sleeping naked. The handkerchief for wiping your face or sneezing, rather than just sneezing into your hand or into the sleeve of your clothes. The fork, so you really cannot eat soup without a spoon, and you really cannot eat meat without a knife. But the fork is just a luxury. You could just use your hand to grab something from the common plate and eat it. But the fork, which is invented somewhere in the 16th century, really gains the popularity greatly because it allows more elegance and privacy. Individual plates rather than using the common dish. Some things connected with the fashion, we'll probably talk about it more as well. For example, the wigs. that are so popular in the 18th century. They become popular because they allow for more hygiene. To wear a wig, people normally shaved their heads or cut their natural hair very short. So it was easier to keep clean, it was easier to limit the lice, the parasites that were quite common. We start having portable bathtubs and wash basins, so the practice of washing the body becomes more popular. So basically people want more privacy, more kind of intimacy. The concepts of elegance and politeness start including things like not spitting and using the handkerchief for sneezing, washing your body, perhaps not taking daily baths if you could not afford that. This was something that only very rich could do, and nobody had a bathroom in the house. The technology was not yet developed. So you'd have portable bathtubs brought into your room, and the servants first filling the bath with water, then moving all the spent water away. So I would say the kind of moderately rich would perhaps have a bath once a week, but otherwise they would have wash basins and they would wash themselves in the bedrooms after waking up, and before going to bed they would just clean their hands, faces, perhaps the décolletage as well. So we have the beginning of the emergence of the middle class. They are not yet called the middle class. They are called usually the middling sort. The middling sort, so somewhere between the nobility and the aristocracy and the peasants. So the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, the city dwellers. They really become visible. They really are the kind of social group that will lead to the most profound changes in continental Europe. These are the groups that are enriched and empowered by the French Revolution. So we have new confidence in the pursuit of happiness, which results in the domestic affection. So the reasons for marriage change, the practice of marriage, the practice of choosing the spouse changes, but it changes very gradually. It's not like that even from one generation to another, or all families suddenly start accepting that young people should choose their own spouses freely. You still have a lot of interference, and many people we know from the diaries and autobiographies, they recall that they were forced into marriage, especially women. They were forced into marriage, especially the first marriage. When a woman was widowed and she had some wealth, she was more at liberty to choose the second husband to be someone she loved or respected, or at least enjoyed some sort of friendly relations with. We will talk about the companionate marriage in week 5, so I leave it at that, and we continue with the men of sentiment and the cult of emotions and some aspects of private life in greater detail next week. So that's it for week 2, and thank you.